So yeah, on the like a traffic radar thing, there is technically a crime scene, but we don't really care about it because the only real relevance to the quote crime scene is if, you know, if somebody tries to bring up in their defense later on that maybe there was some factors that had to do with that. Maybe there was a sign posted there that said a higher speed limit than what it actually was supposed to be, or I don't know, or and maybe the sign was obstructed or something like that. They could maybe address the crime scene, but we don't really process that, right, at all, other than maybe going back and taking pictures of it or something like that later. But if it comes up. So there's times that we don't necessarily do a whole lot of processing. Kind of similarly, you know, if I do a traffic stop and find dope in the car or whatever like that, I usually just collect it and move on. We don't normally like seize the car and, you know, go over the whole thing or whatever. Now, if I find like 20 pounds of dope in the car, you know, we probably do a bit more with that, you know, look, just to make sure we got it all and that kind of stuff. Because believe it or not, there have been times that they have released vehicles after a case is over and then the new owner finds dope that wasn't found by the cops in there. So that being said, but then, you know, if we're talking about a homicide, we're talking about a very serious felony crime. Sometimes we will spend hours or days looking over a crime scene, right? It really kind of depends on what the case is and what you're trying to prove. And it's also pretty, the reason that things are so tedious and time consuming in what we do is because everything we do is going to get scrutinized later if this goes to trial. You know, it doesn't always go to trial. About 70% of the time, it doesn't go to trial. People plea bargain, people, especially on a strong case, you know, it's sometimes not in their better interest to take it to trial, you know, because, you know, they can negotiate a better sentence if they plead guilty. But that being said, that's another debate for another day. But you don't know that when you're processing the crime scene, when you take the initial report or whatever, you don't know if this is one of those ones that's going to get fought in court or one of the ones that's going to get plea bargained. And sometimes what you do makes a difference and influences whether they think they can beat the case or not, right? The thoroughness of your processing and things like that. So there are also ever evolving ways to document and prove something happened or something didn't happen. And likewise, there's also ever evolving ways to fake things and make things look legitimate when they're not, right? So, you know, let me pull up the screen here. So in about 10 seconds on the internet, what is this trying to do? I found an image of the White House blowing up. Is this real? No, it's from a movie. It's from like a really old movie from the 90s called Independence Day with Will Smith, right? Looks a whole lot like the White House blowing up, doesn't it? Right? So that's what, you know, some of the reasons why things are tedious and time consuming with respect to crime scene, you know, processing and evidence collection is because no matter what it is, no matter how damning the evidence is, the other side has an opportunity to scrutinize it, has the opportunity to ask questions about it. Nothing gets presented in court without being verified in some way, shape, or form, right? And so, for example, if I collect, you know, if we were wanting to submit this into court, we'd have to find the source of it, right? And have the source of it, you know, somebody who claimed to be there to take this picture or whatever, and then they would be testifying under penalty of perjury, right? That they were there and they saw the White House blow up, kind of thing. I know it's a ridiculous example, but I'm just saying, you know, there are numerous times in courts where prosecutors think they have really airtight case and then it falls apart because of something they didn't consider. some factor that they didn't consider, some eyewitness, some piece of evidence proves that an eyewitness's testimony wasn't true. They couldn't possibly have seen what happened because they were over here, or because, they have really bad eyesight, or something like that. So everything is subject to scrutiny. And that is why there are a litany of rules that come along with presenting evidence into court. And somebody always has to verify the authenticity of anything that's submitted as evidence. So if I am responding to the scene of a shooting or whatever, and I find a bullet casing and I collect that bullet casing, I'm going to be the one testifying to say, not only did I collect a bullet casing, but yes, this is the one I collected, right? And you have to be able to do that. That's called chain of custody, right? Because if I collect that bullet casing and then it gets mixed up with a bullet casing from a different crime, right? That could really suck for somebody to get tied to a murder they didn't commit, right? Or something like that. So that being said, when we're processing a scene, we have to be kind of meticulous and very thorough in what we do, because it's all subject to scrutiny, and the stakes are high especially when we're talking about a murder, or we're talking about a serious assault or a rape case. I mean, the diligence of your investigation and your adherence to the rules and things like that is going to make or break the case. If you screw up and don't get a warrant when you should have got a warrant, or you mishandle something, or break the chain of custody or whatever, it means that somebody's rapist gets to go free, or somebody's murderer gets to go free in some cases. And so, you have to be well aware of what you're doing and document as much as possible. We will, in this case, or in this class anyway, get around to doing a number of reports, writing exercises. And the purpose of that is that you have to learn how to present a narrative account of your activities and what's happened, what's important, what you observed, what you didn't. And you have to be clear about the source of that knowledge, right? So if somebody tells you, right, that, if you're not first on the scene when you get to a scene, and then the first reporting officer tells you that the door was closed when he got here, you can't just put in your report that the door was closed, because that's going to imply that you observed it. You've got to say, this person told me that. You see what I mean? Like, it's stuff like that. The source of the evidence, source of the knowledge is very important. So you have to be very clear in that. And what that means is that when you interview a suspect and you're trying to write a report about what they told you during the interview, that means you're going to be starting nearly every sentence with so-and-so told me this, so-and-so told me that. And it's going to get real redundant, and you're going to get sick of writing it that way, but that's the way you have to write it, because the source of the information is important. Because during that interview, you may also observe things, right? I observed the scratches on his arm, right? So that's you saying you saw it, right? As opposed to him telling you that he has scratches on his arm. Now you've seen it. And so it's different. So when we come down to the battle in court about whether there were scratches on his arm or what those scratches looked like or whatever, the source of that knowledge needs to be clear. So when we process a crime scene, for the sake of argument in this class anyway, we're going to start with kind of the most in-depth kind of a processing that we're going to do. And that would be like in a homicide case or a shooting case that could turn into a homicide, because that's where we're going to pull in the most resources and do the most thorough job possible. Understand that if we're talking about a traffic stop and I seize, cocaine or whatever, or, in the console or whatever on the traffic stop, I'm not going to get out the crime scene tape, and I'm not going to block the highway for 2 hours while I process this car, right? I'm going to do it quickly. Fact of the matter is, some cops play rather fast and loose with this, and they barely even take pictures of anything, when they're processing that kind of a thing, because they're in a hurry to get back, in action. They got to take this guy to jail and do all this paperwork and stuff like that. Anyway, point that I'm getting at is we don't do the full show for everything, right? We don't pull out all the stops for everything, but when we do, it's because the stakes are really high. So if you're the first on the scene, the major crime scene, your first job, your first responsibility is going to be to help anybody that needs help. Because that's the number one mission in any law enforcement job is public safety, right? So if you arrive on the scene and there's still a man with a gun there, right? You need to address the man with the gun before you can really do anything else. Nothing else is more important than that. If you arrive on the scene and there's no man with the gun, the man with the gun is gone, and you've got people that are injured and need treatment and help, that's your main priority, is to try to save a savable life, right? And what that means too is that you've got to let like ambulance personnel and EMTs and all these other people in there to admittedly screw up your crime scene, because they're going to get their themselves involved in it. They're going to get their footprints in the blood, and they're going to get all this stuff. But if it means that we could save somebody that would have otherwise died, there's no real argument for why you shouldn't do that. But I just want to put that up front, because once there is no longer a threat to public safety, and once there are no longer people that need help, right? And you arrive and they are very much dead, and it's too late to save them. Now that's when you lock it down, try to preserve what's left, keep people out that don't need to be there, that kind of stuff. So your number one priority at a crime, forget that, we ain't writing on the board today. Your number one priority at a crime scene is protect life. If there's people that need help, you need to help them. You need to address any threats to safety that are there as far as that goes. If you respond to a traffic accident, let's forget about the man with the gun thing. You respond to a traffic accident, your first obligation is to try to look for any threats that maybe there's a car that's starting to catch on fire, right? And that means you probably ought to get those people out of there if there's people in there, as quickly as you can, that kind of stuff. That takes the priority over trying to figure out what happened in the accident, or trying to, measure skid marks and take photographs and all that stuff. Your first response is help people that need help, address any threats that are present. We will also need to be directing traffic to try to prevent more accidents from happening there, and that kind of stuff. All of that kind of comes in and is higher priority than the criminal investigation. Once you've kind of gotten to the point where there's no longer a threat to public safety, there's no longer people that need help that aren't getting help, then you start to lock it down, because you want to preserve what you have for as long as possible and document it to the extent that it's possible, because sometimes it's those nuanced little details that you first observe when you first get there, whether the door is open or closed, whether the window's open or closed. That stuff matters sometimes. Sometimes that makes or breaks a case, right? If somebody claims to have witnessed something through this window, but the first responding officers, take pictures or whatever and show that those windows were all closed, those blinds were all closed, but he ain't telling the truth, right? Either that, or the bad guy went and closed the blinds before he left, maybe, but either way, it's something to debate. It's something to talk about. It's something that we need to know the truth about, right? Whether they were open, whether they were closed. That happened a lot. Like if you, probably don't remember, because it's been like 6 or 7 years ago, but the Michael Brown shooting, right? There were people that came forward right off the bat and claimed to be witnesses and said he was shot in the back, he was surrendering, and all this other kind of stuff. 4 months later, when they finally released the results of the investigation, none of that was true. None of it. It was disproven by the physical evidence at the scene. So sometimes people, lie. Sometimes people don't tell the truth. So you need to, any information that you collect, you need to try to cross-reference it with other evidence to either confirm or disprove it. you know, and that's a recurring theme we're going to have throughout the class, right? You're going to verify everything, even stuff you don't think you have to verify. It's redundant. Yes. It's time consuming. Yes. It's also necessary. You know, if somebody tells you that, I don't know, that they were at work, right, during the crime, and you don't have really even suspect them of having committed the crime, are you going to go verify that they were at work? Yep. Yes, you are, because you might be surprised. You know, sometimes it happens. Sometimes it's not the person you think it was, you know, and also sometimes it's good to have that verification so that you can cross them off the list, you know, and say, for sure, they told me that, I verified it, done. Let's move on, you know, and, you know, you've got to verify where you can so that, you know, you have more than one thing to point to in your report and later on in your testimony as to why you pursued certain leads and didn't pursue other leads. Because one of the things that defense attorneys are going to try to do in a homicide case is going to be to say, is it reasonable to think that there could have been other suspects? Did you fail to do some follow-ups that could have proven or disproven that there were other suspects? You know, in the O.J. Simpson trial, they tried to claim that it was, you know, some other unknown individuals, the real killers, is what they tried to call them, you know, but there was never any real evidence submitted that would prove that there was anybody else involved, you know. You know, it was a single set of footprints, happened to be his shoe size, and happened to be a kind of shoe that he had, and they were expensive shoes, and, you know, so on and so forth. So you want to do a thorough job. You want to avoid doing anything that could jeopardize the case and the way that you handle the evidence. So one of the things, and understand too, this was in like 1994. So this was way early before we really had a whole lot of case law and protocol and stuff involved in handling cases involving DNA evidence and stuff like that. But they did some things, some of the order in which they did things, like they collected his reference sample, like they actually took his blood, you know, back then. Now we just do swabs in the mouth to get DNA evidence. Back then they had to draw blood, and they did that prior to processing the other crime scene. And so it's possible, I mean, the odds were like this much, but possible that they could have cross-contaminated something. You know, also at the lab, the way the order in which they presented things or handled evidence could have potentially caused cross-contamination, that kind of stuff. So you have to be mindful of that. If you're working a case where DNA is something that you're after, you got to change your gloves, like, you know, every 5 seconds, you know, every time you touch something, pretty much, you know, because you don't want to be accused of cross-contaminating a sample or something like that. We will, during the class, we will do what, you know, kind of case studies, if you want to call it that. In particular, the two that I'm most interested in doing is the Chris Watts murder thing, because there's a whole lot of stuff on the internet about that, the recording of body camera when the officer first responded to the scene, the recording of his full interview, start to finish. You know, it's just a really interesting case to unpack too, because it's not your typical murder, you know, kind of thing, because he didn't just kill his wife, he killed his 2 kids because they were witnesses to killing his wife. And yeah. Anyway, and then he tried to fake being the distraught dad, and that didn't work. And so anyway, there's that one, and then there's the Gabby Petito case, which I think is also an interesting thing and kind of highlights some things that we need to talk about, particularly in strategy. You know, a lot of crime scene investigation, criminal investigation, is about tactics and strategy. You know, what are you trying to accomplish? What do you need to avoid, you know, and how are you going to get there? So if we were going to search a room, like this is a room that we need to search, and we've got, let's say, 3 people, and we need to search this whole room, what strategy are we going to use to do it, you know, to try to be as thorough as we can be with the resources that we have, versus if we have you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 9 people, you know, and we're going to search this room. Maybe our tactics might be a little different because we've got more bodies. We can be more thorough, you know. So one of the ways, one of the methods to search a room would be line. You know, everybody lines up basically next to each other and proceeds down their lane, you know, and you kind of look to one side, you look to the other. There's a bit of overlap there because you got the person next to you on either side. It's a pretty thorough way of doing it. You can also do what they call a grid, which is where you basically do a line this way and then everybody turns and does a line that way. And that's really thorough. You know, but if you're trying to search a field, you know, you're probably not going to be able to, you're probably going to have these lines being pretty broad, spread apart. Or if you've only got a handful of people to search a large area, if we're talking about the quad out there, there's a body found on the quad out there or whatever, how are you going to search that with, let's say, 5 people? You know, I mean, you know, there's other strategies out there that you can start in the center and spiral out, you know, not as thorough, but it's quicker when you've got less resources. Depends on what you're looking for too. If you're looking for trace evidence, you want the thorough search patterns, the most thorough search pattern that you can get. If you're talking about, you're looking for things that are relatively large, then you can get away with being a little bit less thorough. So, you know, most of the time, you know, when we're talking about like an indoor scene, you know, you can also in a larger scene, you can break it up into smaller chunks. In other words, little squares, and then within the little squares, somebody's searching, you know, and that works if it's a huge scene or something like that. You break it into manageable chunks, you know, and then keep track of who's searching where and stuff like that. There's a lot to keep track of when we're talking about a major crime scene investigation. There has to be somebody in charge and somebody kind of keeping track of who's doing what and where. How do we document, you know, our activities whenever we're doing stuff like that? And it's a narrative report, and you have to write it. And everybody who has any substantial involvement in a case is going to need to write their account of what they did and what they contributed. So that being said, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody that responds to the scene has to write a report if they didn't do anything. If for example, if you're like the 27th person that arrives on the scene of a murder or whatever, they're probably just going to tell you to make sure nobody gets past the crime scene tape. Go stand over there. You have to write a report about that? You don't. Not unless the murderer comes up to you and tries to get in and you end up realizing he's the murderer and you arrest him. Yeah, okay, write your report on that. But other than that, you didn't really contribute anything meaningful, you know, to the thing. So when I say writing a report, I'm talking about, you know, if you were one of the first few people there, if you found particular evidence, you're the one that found a particular piece of evidence, or you were tasked with handling evidence, you went out and had to do canvassing, you know, to see if you could come up with anybody that witnessed anything. You know, it's important that there's a record about who you talked to and when you talked to them, because later on that can become very important if it turns out to be one of the neighbors that did it, you know. And later on they try to claim that they weren't even there, but then there's a record that a cop talked to them 5 minutes after the crime in their apartment, right? That could be relevant. So the reason that we have to be thorough and meticulous is because there's so much we don't know, especially at the beginning of an investigation. And so sometimes things that you at the time don't think are significant later prove to be very, very significant. And so it's important that it's documented. So the first step is help anybody that needs help, address any threats that are present at the crime scene. Beyond that, secure the scene is the top priority. Keep people out that don't need to be there. You know, if the crime scene is in this room, that's easy. Stand outside the door, stand inside the door. There you go, scene secured, right? Nobody gets in. If it's an outdoor scene, that's where you get them putting up the white yellow tape and stuff like that. A lot of times it makes a whole lot of sense to have, especially if this is a high profile thing, something that's going to get media attention and lots of people showing up or whatever. It may be necessary for you to have kind of a buffer zone. Like, here's the edge of your crime scene, you know, and maybe you have another area beyond that where it's only media and VIP people or whatever that are allowed to be there. In theory, even like commanders and stuff at your department, you know, need to like, you know, have a reason for going in. Otherwise, they need to stay in the command center or whatever, you know. That being said, I'm not advocating that you tell your sheriff or your chief not to come in the crime scene. You just got to keep a log. You know, you want to keep a log as early as possible about who's in and out of the crime scene, because that can become relevant later on. Believe it or not, once in a while, there's crimes that are committed by cops or other civilian employees or something like that. And if they had access to the crime scene where there's a conflict of interest, or not even the people that actually work for your department, but maybe their family members or something like that too, you know. And so it could come up. It could be something that gets questioned later on, as whether, you know, okay, your brother is the one that committed this crime, you know, were you at the crime scene? What did you do at the crime scene? Could you have manipulated evidence at the crime scene? Not that you would necessarily, but, you know, all of this stuff has to be thought about, has to be, you know, examined. And so the more records that you have on this, the better. Yes, forget it. That's that. The other thing to talk about, once you have the scene secured, right? Sometimes that's all you can do. Like, you know, you got like 2 officers basically on scene or whatever, and the best you can do is just try to keep people back, keep people out or whatever, you know, and until you get more manpower. And once you have kind of the scene locked down and there is enough people to be able to do more than just work the perimeter, that's when, like, hopefully your detectives show up, your, you know, or your supervisors or whatever, and they start to actually examine the crime scene. And what is the crime scene, you know? And that, it depends. There could be more than one. You know, there was a murder here in Marshall a couple of years ago. If any of you were here then, they locked down the campus twice because of it. It didn't involve a college student, but it was one of the crime scenes was like 2 blocks away, you know, from the campus. And so they did it more as an abundance of caution. But they basically, somebody called the cops, said there were gunshots or whatever, and the cops showed up, and come to find out there was a dead guy there or whatever. And they had locked down the campus for that. And then they had just released the lockdown on the campus, and then another victim ended up managing to get to the hospital and reported that she was shot by the same suspect over on Best Street. So they locked down campus again. I don't even know why they did it the second time. It was nowhere near here, but anyway. And the point that I'm getting at is they had 2 crime scenes connected to the same spree, basically. So you may have more than one crime scene. You may have a very large crime scene. You may have a very small crime scene. It really just depends on what happened, you know, and you don't always know that right up front, right? They didn't know, right, when he left there that he was going to go threaten somebody else over on Best Street, right, and shoot him, but didn't kill him. It was a drug-related thing, and they ended up getting him. And I don't know what happened with it as far as, I mean, I assume he's in prison, but I don't know how long or anything like that. They definitely caught him, definitely charged him, most likely convicted him. But the point that I'm getting at is, there's a lot that you don't know. So usually you err on the side of kind of the largest area that could possibly be part of the crime scene at first, and then you can always kind of hem it in if it turns out not to be the case. So in that case, it was a house, right? There was a house with a dead guy in the house. So what was the crime scene? The entire property, yard included, right? That's the crime scene. You know, maybe initially the best you could do is to secure the house, right? But once you have enough people, that yard could be, could be that he, racked his firearm in the yard and there's a bullet casing laying in the yard, or if he did it with a revolver or something, maybe that's where he dumped his rounds, or maybe he dropped something as he's fleeing, maybe he dropped his wallet. I mean, things have happened. There was a case in Warrensburg while I was in the police academy where they tried to, they tied a chain around the bumper of their car and tied the other end of that chain around an ATM and tried to take off with it. Ripped their bumper off. It was their car. Bumper had their license plate on it. That was a pretty easy investigation, I think. So, you do need to think about where could there be evidence. And if you think there could be evidence somewhere, then it probably needs to be included until you can determine that, right? If the crime is in this room, right? What's the crime scene? Well, definitely this room. But could there also be a blood trail? Like if I stepped in the blood and I tracked the blood out of here, there could be a blood trail going halfway down the stairs or all the way out of the building or whatever. So it could get rather large. Anywhere there where you reasonably think there could be evidence is part of the crime scene. And it varies from case to case, and there's really no consistency with that. It really just depends on what happened. In the simplest of crime scenes, it's literally like one room, one corner of the room, or something like that. In other cases, it stretches out and gets pretty convoluted. So once you have secured the perimeter, now you're starting to look for evidence, and you're going to initially just look for evidence, and you're going to take photographs. The earliest thing that you should be doing at a crime scene, once you get past that initial stuff I was talking about, is take some photographs. And that's the thing, and sometimes in the drug cases that the cops forget to do, they just, oh, what's this? And they pick it up and they take it. And technically they should be taking a picture of it in place before they seize it. That's the protocol. That's the best practices. But they can get away with it sometimes in the minor cases because what are you going to try to claim, right? That it wasn't there, that they planted it. I guess that's really the only thing that you could possibly say. But even if they wanted to plant it, they could still plant it and take a picture of it and then collect it again, right? So, I mean, whatever. The point that I'm getting at is you want to document the scene as it is before you start changing things or moving things or doing anything like that. Because sometimes it's really important. Where did you find that? Where was that bullet casing? Because bullets, when they're discharged from a firearm, usually, unless you have some kind of a specialty made gun, they're normally going to discharge out the right side. Most people are right-handed, and that's the way that guns are made for right-handed people for the most part. And so if you find your bullet casings over here, then that probably means that the shooter was standing somewhere in this neighborhood, right, when they shot. Whereas if they're over there, then maybe they were standing on the other side. So you've got to document the scene with photographs as soon as possible. And then once it's been documented that way, then you can start to, and the overall scene should be searched before you start trying to collect individual evidence. Then you can start to collect each individual piece of evidence. And that's, could be anything from just picking up that bullet casing and putting it in a bag to, if we're talking about like blood evidence, you're going to have to collect it in a vial or collect it, with, what do you call it? Q-tips or whatever, swabs, whatever the case may be. The other thing in a major crime scene is somebody's going to have to do some degree of a sketch, and of course nowadays if somebody's like confident and knows what they're doing, they could probably do it on a computer pretty easy, but it's also pretty common that it's just something that's done on the scene, kind of a rudimentary sketch. In order for you to do a sketch, you kind of need to have dimensions, you need to have measurements, you need to, you know, be able to locate things in the scene and then reproduce that location, you know, on a sketch, whether you're doing it on a computer, whether you're doing it on freehand or whatever. It's important because eventually when this goes to court, right, there's going to be representations of the crime scene that are going to be presented. And you see that in some of the higher profile cases, right? They'll have drawings, they'll have renditions of the crime scene. It's also important, like in a traffic accident kind of scenario too, that you have a diagram. That's why in the STARS report, it's got a place for you to draw a diagram of the traffic crash and how it played out, because, you know, eventually in court, you know, people aren't going to see the crime scene. They are not going to visit the crime scene. They're going to have to rely on your pictures, and they're going to have to rely on maybe an overall sketch to kind of put things in perspective, right? If I tell you that the crime started in the kitchen and ended in the living room, well, it depends on the layout of the house. How far away is the kitchen from the living room? It could be right next to the kitchen, and it could be on the other side of the house, you know? So having the diagrams help. So when you're doing a crime scene or preparing to do a crime scene sketch, you've got to get measurements of all the evidence, and you got to log it, you know, so write it down. And that's tedious and time consuming. Usually in a room like this, we use what's called rectangular coordinates. In other words, this room is roughly square. And I say roughly because this building is like 100 and some odd years old. So most likely it is not perfectly square. If I took an actual, you know, carpenter square or whatever and put it in the corner there, it would probably be just a little bit one way or another, but it's close enough for government work. So if you take and measure, and this is a relatively straight wall, so if you measure, let's say 5 inches, 90 degrees to this wall, and, you know, or feet, whatever, 3 feet from this wall and 5 feet from that wall, there's a spot, and that's reproducible, right? And in any rectangular room or whatever rectangular sketch, you could reproduce that location by taking those measurements and moving it in a scaled down drawing or whatever to that thing. So if one inch equals 1 foot or whatever, instead of going 3 feet, you'd go 3 inches. Instead of going 5 feet, you'd go 5 inches, and you'd have a scale drawing. So that's probably the most common thing. That's the only thing I've ever actually used in real life, and taking measurements. It's always, you know, but if you're talking about an outdoor scene, if you're talking about a traffic crash, that can get rather complex, right? Because you're not going to have that 90-degree thing. You can do what they call a baseline, where you're actually picking 2 fixed points, you know, like trees or power lines or something like that, and you're putting basically a string between them, and then you're measuring off of that 90 degrees to that. You can also do what they call triangulation. So like in the quad here, where they have trees, you could pick 2 trees and measure, you know, where those and where those 2 measurements intersect. It should be the only place that they intersect. So you can measure that way. That being said, the only thing we're really going to work on in this class is the rectangular coordinates, because I don't really want to get that off in the weeds with it. But just know they also have a thing called a total station now, where you can actually, where it will actually take all these measurements for you and reproduce based on like GPS coordinates and stuff like that. And it will actually do a lot of this stuff for you if you work for a department that has money and, you know, they train you on it and stuff like that. We're more just kind of reinforcing the foundational principles here. So what we're going to do as our first assignment, and I'm not actually going to make the assignment until Tuesday, because I never make an assignment before the last day to drop, but I'm just kind of giving you guys a preview and a heads up. Your first assignment is going to be to draw a sketch. I'm not going to be grading you on your artistic abilities. I'm going to be grading you on having information that I say needs to be in that sketch, on that sketch, right? So okay. I'm trying to think. Oh, I know what I can do. Okay, so when you're drawing a sketch, you need to have certain information on there so that it's clear what that drawing is meant to represent. And also where it fits into the larger picture. So for example, you know, when I've said earlier, there's a crime scene that starts in the kitchen and ends in the living room or whatever. You're probably going to have a sketch of the kitchen, a sketch of the living room, and then maybe an overall sketch showing them in relation to each other. Does that make sense? Because the smaller, basically the larger the scale of your drawing, the less detail you can have in it, right? So if I'm just drawing the sketch of what happened in the kitchen, I can make it large enough so that you can actually tell what's going on there. Whereas if I'm drawing a sketch of the whole house, it's just basically like a floor plan, you know, like what you'd find like on the internet if you're looking at like house designs and stuff like that. They'll have like a floor plan showing where the doors and windows are, stuff like that. So on your sketch, you need to have certain information on there. And I'm only making this large font because I want you guys to be able to read what I'm writing up here, and I can't write on the board. So we're going to do it this way. So everything is tracked by a case number in law enforcement, right? So case number needs to be on there for sure. You know, normally at every department that I've worked for, case number starts with the year, sometimes month and day. At one department, it was year, month, and day, and then you had your chronological numbering that started over again every January, you know, 001, 0002, 0003, on and so forth. So something like that, you know, or it could be, what is today? 01, 1, 2, and then 0001, you know, something like that. That varies from place to place. In Pettis County, we only track it by cases that we actually pull reports for. So not every call for service that you go on is going to need a report, right? It's unfounded if it's super minor or whatever. Nothing significant happens, right? There's no need to write a report about it. In Cole County, that case number was basically the dispatch number. So it wasn't the advantage of doing it where you're only pulling report numbers and they're separate from the dispatch numbers is that it makes it easier to track cases, like for administrators, because every case with a number should have a report, right? Whereas in Cole County, it was more difficult to track which cases needed reports because it wasn't sequential like that. Anyway, that's a ramble. So case number, and then you want to put the offense on here. If you've got multiple offenses, you can pick the most significant one on here, whatever it is. So it depends kind of on what's going on. It could be that the offense is that you were called, you know, to a shooting, right? So it could be that you were somebody discovered a dead body and you don't even know when it happened, you know, or it could be something like that. Most often what you're going to put in here is death investigation, because you don't want to necessarily jump to conclusions too quickly, right? It may be very obvious, and sometimes you can just tell by the way the call comes out, like that this is a suicide, or that this is a natural death, or something like that. You want to kind of try to refrain from putting that into any official paperwork until you've made an actual determination, right? And usually that comes after an autopsy and after, everything's done. So usually you're just going to put death investigation rather than an actual crime. But it depends, right? If there's an actual crime to put in there, then you can put an actual crime in there. Location is the physical address where this took place. So, in the case of if the crime happened right here in this room, it would be 500 East College. Would be the location. Scene is where it's at that address, where it's at that location. So in this case, the scene would be Beatty Hall, room 306. Right? The date and the time. And that would be the date and the time that you responded, not the date and the time that the accident happened or the thing happened. Technically, if you wanted to, you could insert in here offense date and offense time. If it's known, it's just frequently you don't know. So you want to know the date and the time that it was reported. This is what we call the title block, right? And again, normally it's not big font. I'm just putting it in big font so you guys can see it. And then who sketched it? So that'd be your name. And where this needs to be on your sketch kind of varies. It depends on how much of the paper that you're taking up with your sketch kind of thing. If your sketch is taking up kind of the whole paper, you can put this on the back side of the paper. Or, if it doesn't, then you put it above or below it, wherever it fits, Generally, if this is something that's typed on there, we're probably talking like what you would normally type like a research paper. So like maybe 12-point font, 14-point font, something like that. Doesn't need to be big, doesn't need to be super small either. Just needs to be something that people can read and know what this is, what it belongs to, that kind of stuff. And then you're also going to have kind of a legend based on, because you're going to end up putting like evidence and depicting evidence in your diagram, right? And so, evidence A, B, C, D, and what it is needs to be on there as well. Kind of separate from this. Usually it's, usually that can be kind of written either right adjacent to or sometimes even on the sketch itself, depending if there's free space, what A stands for, B stands for. It definitely needs to be something, that is easy to see on there. So let's say that A is a bullet casing. B is, I don't know, a knife. C is you know, you get the point, right? Whatever the evidence is, you just kind of indicate what that stands for. So what you're typically going to do is you're going to draw, basically measure length and width of the room. From experience, I have found that it's usually best to measure twice, cut once. So like I usually will take a measurement on one side of the room width-wise, and then I'll walk down and take another measurement width-wise. Once in a while, I catch mistakes that way where I wrote it down wrong the first time or something like that, or looked at it wrong the first time. Usually you're not going to see it vary from one side of the room to the other more than maybe 1/4 inch or so. If you got a really old house or something like that that's settled a lot, you may have more significant differences, you know, in which case then maybe that ought to be noted in your sketch. I don't know. Depends on what you're dealing with. It's usually not that important as long as you're accurate within about 1/4 inch. You know, it's usually pretty good on your length and width measurements. Now, when you're measuring to your evidence, you want to be precise, but within 1/8 inch. But that being said, you're going to measure length and width of the room. You get into a room like this, it kind of sucks. Like, turn around and look at the back of this room. Tell me you want to sketch this. No, you don't, right? Because how do you do that? How do you do that? You know, and the truth of the matter is, that's not as hard. You know, protrusion into the room isn't quite as hard, because you can just draw the big square box and then measure that, how big it is, and deduct that out. That's not too hard. That one's a bear, you know, because it's like angles and stuff. You know, not gonna lie, you know, that would suck to have to actually put in a legit crime scene sketch. You just kind of do the best you can, you know, especially if you don't have any real experience with, like, you know, construction or something like that. You just draw it as close as you can. You always want to try to draw something as close to scale as you can get it, and then write not to scale on the sketch, so they don't rake you over the coals on the stand trying to say you weren't precise enough or whatever. That being said, it is what it is. You usually don't have stuff like that, though. That's more common in really old kind of buildings like this, and in newer houses they tend to make them pretty square. So that being said, you know, when I give you the assignment, I'm just going to have you do either your bedroom at home or your dorm room, or just something, whatever the simplest room you think you can sketch is, and get a measurement of it, draw the room itself, and then whatever the major pieces of furniture are that's going to be in the room, kind of measure roughly where they are, put them in there. You don't have to label them or anything like that. It's just they're obstructions and stuff, so it kind of helps to get the whole point of doing a sketch, right, is to get an idea of the layout, right? And so if we're doing a sketch of this room, right, we need to know if there's something here, right? It's not just open, you know. So major pieces of furniture includes like couches, chairs, beds, tables, you know, anything kind of big and hard to move, you know. Somebody's backpack on the floor is not a major piece of furniture, right? You don't need to include somebody's backpack in the sketch unless it's a major piece of evidence, unless it's something that actually has something that's relevant to the case. If it's evidence A or whatever, then yeah, you can draw it on the sketch. But when I say major pieces of furniture, I'm talking about bigger things that are harder to move, you know, not just everything that's on the floor. Because trust me, you have a hard time doing that in some of these houses that we raid. I'm trying to think what I didn't cover. I feel like I covered everything there. When you're documenting these measurements, you need to know which direction north is. Does anybody know off the top of their head which direction north is? You had it right. Yeah, behind you. Right? How do you know which direction north is? Depends. Like right now, there's no sun to look at, right? um, but you can actually use your phone to determine it if you pull up. Okay. Hold on a sec. So I just got emailed it. I thought the map app had a north on it. It doesn't. Yeah. You can usually figure it out without having your phone though. What do you call it? Broaden your map out, kind of look for something you know is one direction or another. If you're in your hometown, you ought to be pretty oriented to which directions that things are. Point of the matter is you need to know which way is north and you need to indicate it on your sketch, right? A little arrow and an in, which way is north. And when you're taking your measurements, you should be documenting it based upon which wall you're measuring from, because otherwise it's going to get hard to keep track of this, because you're basically going to have you and a partner, or maybe you and a couple other people or whatever that are going to be with tape measures, measuring things off and doing things like that. When you're doing it, somebody's going to be writing it down, as you go. And so you need to know, number one, what are we measuring for? Like this is, bullet casing 1 or whatever, and it's this far from the west wall and this far from the north wall. So you got to kind of keep your directions in that, because otherwise all you're going to have is a bunch of numbers later on when you're trying to put this together, and that sucks, and so you need to kind of orient all of your measurements to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. If you have a house that's a weird thing, kind of faces, where nothing is true, whatever, you could do northeast, southeast wall or whatever, or you could just pick, we're going to call this one the north wall, we're going to call this one whatever. It's really, that's just for you when you're writing down those measurements. That's so that you can put it on the sketch. It's not really something you have to turn in with, your notes with the report or anything like that. So whatever you've got to do to keep it straight in your head so that when you put it on the sketch, everything lines up where it should be as far as, the evidence and stuff like that goes. So anyway, I will formally introduce that assignment on Tuesday if you guys want to get a head start on it. It really is just sketch a room and stick some evidence in there. And I don't really care what the evidence is. Just make something up. Bullet casing, knife, blood spatter, body, whatever. Don't care. Just get your feet wet a little bit with it. And it'll actually be due next Thursday.